families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Families Divided TV. Parental alienation is considered a psychological presentation in children and a legal dispute about which parent has the child's best interest at heart. For the first time, sociological research finds that parental alienation is also a social and public health issue, disrupting families and the capacity of parents to fulfill their roles. It is the cancel culture that no one talks about. It is no coincidence that parental alienation was first formulated in the 1980s at the same time as profound changes in society, life, and in work. These significant changes changed the family from an institution to a fluid network of family relationships, unchanged from a single household. The family as a network of relationships is vulnerable to one family member corrupting those connections. Such corrupted, alienated family relationships lead to an idea of a family unrecognizable to most parents. Parental alienation is a symptom of more significant alienation in our society that separates people from their social connections and identity. It threatens the idea of a family, the value of family relationships to children, and what it means to be a parent. The solution may lie in de-alienating public policies that promote and protect nurturing family relationships and reconnect people in personal, cultural, and social dimensions. In this episode, Dr. Stan Korosi from Australia, who is a professional clinical socialist and counselor, will bring you this presentation, and let me tell you, it really is dynamic. Also in this episode, you're going to hear from Dr. Mary Alvarez. She's one of our presenters at our upcoming fall conference, Alienating the Truth Regarding the Trauma and the Abuse. I emphasize the word truth because in this conference, you're going to be hearing from some of the top experts in the world regarding alienation is abuse. So many out there, or may I say some out there, are trying to say there is no such thing as alienation. That is not true. And in this conference, we're bringing strong emphasis with forensic evidence that it is true. So please, if you're a professional or an alienated family member, you do not want to miss this conference. It is a virtual international conference. It runs from October 13th through the 15th. The cutoff date to register is October the 8th. So please don't miss this conference. There will be 5 different Q&A sessions where you can ask questions live to the presenters. So please don't miss this. We're doing so much planning and so much is in this conference that it's going to be the best that we have ever had out of the 6 conferences we've put on. So please, you don't want to miss it. So please be with us. And if you've never been a subscriber to the Families Divided TV YouTube channel, please subscribe. We would love for you to do that. It helps so much. And if you have want to get the notifications, then just hit that little bell and you'll get notified of notifications. So we ask you to subscribe, hit the bell, and we're going to be back in just a moment with Dr. Mary Alvarez and Dr. Stan Korosi.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Sadly, too many know the pain and trauma associated with parental and grandparent alienation. Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, will present an important international virtual conference on October the 13th through the 15th, 2023. Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse will feature world-renowned experts in the field of alienation. You'll join conference event coordinator Elaine Cobb and moderator Megan Hunter as they introduce you to keynote speaker Dr. Edward Crook. Plus, you'll hear important presentations from Dr. Joshua Coleman, Lisa Rothfuss, Dr. Mary Alvarez, Chris Smith, Bill Eddy, Dr. Sue Kornbluth, Dr. William Burnett, Melanie Gill, and Megan Hunter. Join the many attendees already securing their spot for the conference. Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse. Visit familyaccess.info for all the details. This special conference is being hosted by Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, by Still Partners Foundation, and by PASCA. Parental alienation is child abuse.
Well, thank you for joining me here today. I'm going to be talking about parental alienation as a social issue, and particularly about how it's a cancel culture, the cancellation of a parent's identity that harms both the parent and the child. What we're talking about here is a cancel culture no one's talking about. There are significant implications that arise from this treatment of parental alienation as a social issue for family and society. And at the end, I'll talk about where we need to go to deal with that. So let's go backwards in time a little bit to see where the social context for parental alienation first started. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a big revolution around the world, but very prominently in places like the USA, the UK, and certainly here in Australia. There was a reorganisation of social roles and the nature of family, driven by the feminist movement, who wanted equality for themselves, for women, and the reordering of the family to better address some of the issues they faced as women. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, and I'm on their side for equality. What it meant was that the family changed completely. It was no longer gender-based. Some of the traditional social roles for men and women in families, historically understood right up to that point, changed dramatically. And some of the more extreme ideologies emerged in the 1960s and 70s that formulated the family as a site of oppression, as an entrenched place where patriarchy reigned supreme. And so some of the more extreme ideologies were promoting the idea that there was no longer a place for the traditional family in our society, and it should be destroyed, and that resources should be allocated to women as a social group, because women were better at allocating resources and distributing them than men were. Makes you wonder whether those ideas about reordering the family, about changing the gender-based roles in families, and even destroying the family as a social institution, raises the question whether those ideas are alive and well today and driving our social and legal policies. Alongside these radical and extreme ideas, and these ideas go well beyond equality, they go to the nature of power, and in fact could be construed as a naked grab for power by extreme groups and ideologies. Also around the same time, the nature of society changed dramatically. The way we perceive reality, but how we know what we know changed. It's what we call a post-structural society. So historically, we placed a lot of trust in our social institutions, in our government, in legal institutions. We don't do that anymore. And partially that's due to the way society changed from objective reality based on a reality outside one's experience to a subjective reality that we construct ourselves in our social relationships. That means all reality is subjective. And so everyone's idea of what their reality is given equal prominence. The way that manifests is that theories about the Earth being round and theories about the Earth being flat are now equal. They're both subjective realities because in a post-structural philosophy, there is no objective reality that we can perceive directly. That might sound complex, but the way it ends up is into ideas that we have right now about the nature of identity and gender, that they are socially constructed ideas and notions. Our identity is not something intrinsic to ourselves that we're born with. It's allied with the idea of one is born with a soul as something unique to that individual. In a socially constructed context, there's no such thing. Our identities are constructed and experienced through our relationships with other people in our social situations. And the same with gender. This is where the distinctions are made between sexuality and gender. You're born with one and you socially construct the other. The nature of power changed dramatically in this theory. Power used to be allocated through our social roles. It was distributed through social and legal institutions. Police officers, lawyers, doctors, other medical practitioners, government officials, elected representatives, all had power assigned to them traditionally by the roles they played in society, by the institutions that society created that contained the power that they exercised. Now we have something called power relations, and that is power exercised through interpersonal communication. The way we talk to people, the narratives we use, all convey power in some way. And that is the nature of power right now. So a good example of that are the influencers on Instagram and TikTok and other social media. They are exercising power through the way they communicate with you. So let's move on to looking at parental alienation in a social context. So historically, parental alienation has been considered a clinical and legal problem. It's a clinical diagnosis or assessment, principally in clinical psychology, and it's a legal dispute that needs to be resolved typically in the family court. Legally, it's actually a competition between two very different views of what is in a child's best interest. So an alienated parent will have a particular view of what would work best for their child, what will be in their best interests, and so will the alienating parent. And a judge effectively has to decide between two subjective realities, each of which could equally exist. If a judge decides that an alienating parent's version of reality better suits the child, that doesn't mean that the alienating parent's version of reality goes away. It's still there because subjectively, both can exist at the same time. Oddly enough, if you think about it, a round Earth and a flat Earth can't exist at the same time as objective realities. But as I said before, we don't have a way of directly perceiving them. Again, coming back to the alienated children, in a social context, nothing really changes. We still have a parentally induced resistance to a relationship with the other parent. It still is a form of child psychological abuse and family violence. When we look at it socially, we see attitudes and psychological states present in children and parents that tell us something about the social processes that go on in families. The previous theories about power relations, about communicating power through words and narratives, That's how alienation happens in families. They are actually communicated actions. For targeted parents, traditionally the focus is off them from a psychological, legal thinking points of view, but socially, they are the pigeons in the coal mine or canaries in a coal mine signaling to us that something has gone wrong in the family. So typically what happens in an alienating family is a targeted parent is stigmatized and marginalized out of the family. The stigmatization is often about a false allegation of family violence or sexual abuse, or that otherwise targets them as being unsafe, unavailable, unempathetic, and unnecessary. And on that basis, they are rejected. And the social term for rejection is they're marginalized in the family, pushed out to the limits and pushed out of the family. An important thing to consider is the way the family changed from the 1960s and 70s, and specifically from the 1980s, and I'll talk more about that down the track. We now have what's called an unstructured family. So families used to be a solid social institution down through the centuries. Family as an institution has been highly respected in every part of society. But now it's a voluntary notion. It's at will. It's actually a flexible family configuration. One way to think about it is that when no-fault divorce was introduced, families could dynamically change simply because one parent decided they didn't want to be together with the other one. And so it became fluid and flexible and easy to change. So a bit more on the unstructured family, because that's an important social context for parental alienation, because it is in the family that alienation happens. It was first observed in the 1980s, around the time when there was campaigns for equal rights, no-fault divorce, single parenting became more prevalent. And so the nature of family is now an idea, a voluntary network of relationships that spans geography and place. Families can exist not just in one household, but in multiple households, and also across social media. They can be virtual experiences. So I think of them as more of a configuration rather than a system, because a configuration allows us to think about how easily they can be changed by one parent just deciding they don't want to be part of that family anymore, or they want to change that family completely. I talked earlier about socially constructed identity. And that is the idea that structural roles like mum and dad, which are historically identified by gender, no longer exist in the same way now as they did historically. You've all heard about identity politics and how people basically fight for their identity to be recognized in social spaces. And as soon as you impinge on someone's social identity, they're onto you. And that's because their identity is tied to the narratives that are established in interpersonal spaces, in communication with others. So in a sense, because you don't own your identity, somebody else can take it away. And that's exactly what happens in alienation. A parental role is destroyed, annihilated. And a parent who once knew themselves to be a mother or a father can no longer hold that identity in the family. As I said before, sex is biology, gender is social and performative. That is, it's socially constructed. It's a big price to pay when you think about it, that another parent in a family can define a child's relationship with them as a price that child pays for an identity. Now, that is a parental alienation behavior, because children learn that they have to follow their favored parents' constructions of the other parent, their favored parents' views of the other parent, in order to have a relationship with that parent. Because an alienating parent can signal very implicitly that they do not approve of the child being favorable to the targeted parent. That's a way of also corrupting the attachment between the child and the favored parent. It's also a corruption of power, an abuse of power. I talked previously about power relations, about actions communicated in narratives, and power communicated in narratives. A good example of that would be a child spending a weekend with their non-resident parent, and the parent with whom they are resident may say to them, well, do you really want to see mum and dad this weekend? It's okay to say no. I don't know what to do with myself while you're away. Just remember, you can call me anytime. These are very common narratives we hear between children and alienating parents. They actually communicate power over the child. The child gets a very clear message that there's something wrong with the parent they want to spend the weekend with. And so they may start resisting. It's okay. I don't have to go this weekend. This is how the new form of power, what we call power relations, becomes abused in alienation. Those of you involved with the family violence field will know what I mean by perspecticide. Another term is gaslighting. But perspecticide is a form of coercive control. It's about controlling someone's ideas, about how they perceive reality. And children can be coerced into such a reality by their favoured parent. So children who are inducted into a false allegation of family violence and child sexual abuse will believe it as though it actually happened, even though there is no basis for the claim. Unfortunately, they make excellent witnesses in a context in which children's claims of family violence and sexual abuse are treated implicitly as true. That is an example of an ideology that has collapsed upon everyone in society. In actual fact, there's research to suggest that up to 25% of claims of family violence and child sexual abuse are deliberately misleading. It's not just in Australia, that's mirrored elsewhere in the world. And so alienation involves inducing a child into an artificial false reality directed by the alienating parent. And the problem is that the narratives, the words, the way these parents communicate create family culture and structure that looks solid, looks like it has always existed. And the problem with that is that children respond to that as though it's perfectly normal. We talk about parental alienation in the family. In psychology, we consider parental alienation to be a diagnosable, or at least assessable, psychological condition, even illness, principally in children who are alienated. Socially, we look at parental alienation as a broader, or a subset actually, of social alienation. And social alienation is a bigger condition in society, and its definition is that it separates people from the means to fulfill social roles and identities. A good example might be racism, where groups that are targeted for racial discrimination are unable to access the same means, the same jobs, the same education, the same social resources as those who don't share their racial characteristics. The same is true for alienated parents inside the family. They're no longer able to exercise their authorities, their roles, their identities as a parent. They're completely disempowered, and children treat them with contempt and disrespect, refuse to follow their directions. Now, this was first observed in the 1950s and 60s as a condition following World War II. In the 1980s, social commentators were observing that our society was, in fact, an alienated and alienating society, and that people were feeling quite isolated from their capacity to make their way through society. At the same time, parental alienation was first formulated in around 1985 by Dr. Richard Gardner. And I would suggest that is no coincidence, because parental alienation is actually a symptom in the family of a broader socially alienated society in which we find ourselves today. There are a number of dimensions to social alienation, both in society and in families. The ones that are particularly of interest, the idea of social deviancy, isolation, and stigma. I've talked about stigma before, about collapsing upon a parent, a negative identity that they can't escape from. Isolation occurs because alienated people tend to avoid social contexts, social situations where they might be stigmatized for who they are and what they are. And social deviancy, I'll talk more about later. But for now, think of it as the ends justify the means. Unacceptable behaviours to achieve social aspirations. How does that manifest in families? How does social alienation in the form of parental alienation become obvious in a family? It becomes obvious when a targeted parent starts questioning whether they are in fact a parent at all. They might ask, am I still a parent? There's a lot of ideology going around today, a bit like saying there's a lot of viruses going around today, but the wars of today are about ideas. Everything I've talked to you about today so far emerged in the 1960s and 70s from our universities. These were ideas and philosophies written about and talked about in those sectors. And they have made their way into our society right now, and they're being put into action. Concepts like fake news. How do you know something is true or not? The use of misinformation and disinformation to discredit ideas. The way politics and language go together. How we speak, what we speak, signals the politics that we subscribe to and the realities that we support. That leads us to a situation where we have what I call anti-family laws, where parental alienation is treated as a pseudo concept, where rebuttal of shared care and shared parenting occurs. Now, if you go back to the traditional notions of the family, there was the implicit idea that both parents would share the care of their children and share the responsibility of their children. Some of you who may remember what a traditional family might look like will know that typically dad went out to work, he provided, he protected, mum stayed at home, and she nurtured and she cared. She ran the house, dad ran everything outside the house. Whether you like it or not, it actually worked, at least to a certain extent, up to the point where women started to feel abused and discriminated against. But certainly there were no doubts about the roles people played. Now, we no longer have that shared care, shared parenting notion. So when I say anti-family law, what I mean is we have family laws around the world being proposed that don't have a concept of family in them. So we have laws that have nothing to do with families. We also have laws that are now focused on family violence, principally to protect women and children. They are not family laws, they are family violence laws, and they ignore the prevalence of false and misleading allegations. Some of you may be aware of the UN Special Rapporteur's recommendations to not use the concept of parental alienation. You've seen our collective response to that. They basically ignored the science because it's not relevant to their ideology. If they want to believe that the earth is flat, they can dispense with any other objective information that says it's round. So there's a concept called identicide, which is basically the destruction of identity, specifically the destruction or devaluing of parental identity. And stigmatization is the process used to destroy parental identity. So a parent can be stigmatized because they are violent, they are abusive, they've sexually abused the child, or they're emotionally absent, or mentally ill, they're neglectful. And this also goes together with false allegations. False allegations are particularly powerful because they trigger automatic protective responses from our social and legal institutions without the right of response and the presumption that that parent is actually guilty. So I call this the cancel culture no one's talking about, because it's suddenly become normal in our society to cancel a parental identity without due cause and to recruit children to do the cancelling. And that is incredibly harmful for children to do that. I talked earlier about social deviancy, and I left you a tag about the ends justify the means. So we need to delve into that, because what we observe in alienating parents is that they are generally prepared to eliminate the targeted parent by whatever means necessary, without regard to how that harms their children. And that's what I mean by the ends justify the means. It is a known dimension of social alienation where people commit crimes or commit other actions using behaviours that basically violate their own moral conduct and codes of behaviour, because they perceive that's the only way they can fulfil their social aspirations. For example, if you are in a situation where you can perceive yourself as never being able to own a car or never owning a television set, then stealing one becomes an acceptable means of achieving that social aim when there's no other way of doing it. So what we have is amorality under the guise of protecting the children. And the difference between immorality and amorality is that with amorality, there is no moral code of conduct, and immorality means there is one, but we're not following it. And so in an alienating family, an alienated family, alienating parents show no moral compass whatsoever. They will act as though the ends justify the means. And that means that in some cases, parental alienation behaviours may be fatal. They may kill. And so there are situations where, again, using narratives, communicating actions that perpetuate false beliefs that the targeted parent is unsafe or dangerous. I use the term discursive violence to mean narratives and words that convey information that vilifies or stigmatizes a parent, that treats them with contempt. Those same narratives can communicate violent, unsafe and dangerousness themes. So all the words that are used in the family to describe a targeted parent convey the message that they're unsafe. Just like the example I gave previously about that child seeing a parent on the weekend and their residential parent telling them, "You sure you want to go? You know you can call me anytime." That's an example of how a non-residential parent, the implication is they're unsafe. And worst of all is that we start seeing violent narratives, violent words, calls to violent and potentially lethal action in a family without moral regard. There have been several examples over the years of alienating parents killing the targeted parent or commissioning their children to do the same. So where do we go from here? So far, just a quick recap, we're now seeing social alienation and parental alienation in a parent-child relationship. Interesting metaphor. Parental alienation is a form of social alienation. It results in social actions, social states, psychological states and attitudes that signal the way culture and norms have changed in the family. We need to start moving the science into the social sphere. We have won the science battle. There's no question that parental alienation is a valid and blossoming field of science all of its own. And that's because it ties directly to broader social themes like social alienation. It's very well grounded in social work and sociology, but hasn't been studied sufficiently in those fields. We need to move into the social space and the political space. The way we deal with our antagonists who oppose parental alienation and ignore the science that supports it is to exploit their internal contradictions. Most extreme ideologies ultimately fail because they have contradictions they can't resolve. They ultimately oppress and harm the social groups and people they claim to protect. For example, again, going back to the UN Special Rapporteur's investigation into parental alienation and violence against women and children, to defeat parental alienation, because that's their ideology, They are prepared to sacrifice alienated mothers. They have no concept of how a mother may be alienated from her children, because in their view, there's no such thing as alienation. So does that mean alienated mothers are actually perpetrators? Or what? And so in this way, those people who support the idea that parental alienation is a pseudo concept are prepared to throw alienated mothers literally under the bus. That's an internal contradiction that we can exploit. We need to start driving the narratives in policy and media. We need to have policy strategies and access mainstream media. It's not enough just to talk about parental alienation in our traditional channels because we're preaching to an audience who already supports us. We need to be in the spaces where they don't. We need to have policies about the role of family in society and how it's in the best interest for the children. We need to think about policies about family relationships, shared parenting. What does contact interference mean? Should it be a crime against children? And how to deal with abduction. But above all, we need to have a seat at the policy table. We need to be the reasonable voice about an inclusive form of social violence that includes everyone, regardless of gender, regardless of family. We're not just selective about who we deal with. That's the difference between parental alienation as a form of coercive control and family violence and the more traditional, or better known, gendered theories about family violence. Well, thank you for listening to me today, and look forward to hearing from you. Bye for now.
Hi, this is Dr. Mary Alvarez. I am a psychologist in Austin, Texas, and do a lot of work in the field of parental alienation. I'm so happy to be part of the 2023 conference this coming year and would like to help you understand my topic, what I will be discussing. So my title is Parental Alienation is a Form of Child Psychological Abuse. And so no longer is this disputed in the field by the experts in parental alienation. And what I would like to illustrate in my talk is how psychological abuse meets the criteria for an adverse childhood experience. And then there's lots of research on adverse childhood experiences and what happens to a child's psychological as well as brain development. And so since parental alienation is considered psychological abuse, then we can extrapolate that the things that happen to children who experience adverse childhood experiences are happening to children who have been influenced by a parent unnecessarily and unduly against the other parent, and that relationship has been interfered and fractured. So we will talk about some of the effects that happen to children currently when one parent is trying to erase the other parent from the child's life, such as the rates of depression, the rates of anxiety, the rates of externalizing behavior, which would be things like conduct problems, oppositional defiance in the child. I'll also discuss with you the role of toxic stress and what happens neurologically to a child's brain development when they are in toxic stress as a result of parental alienation. And the research also underscores what can happen long term to these children, again, both psychologically as well as neurologically. There are some neurological effects that appear to be permanent. And so that's very serious. And my commitment to parental alienation is to reduce those negative outcomes for children through the services that I provide and the educational services that I do. Because while you can't necessarily see what's happening at the time that the child is involved in an alienation situation, the research will illustrate what does happen and what potentially can happen long term. So I look forward to 2023 and invite you to view my conference participation piece. Thank you very much.
Next week on Families Divided TV, Randy Flood shares with us the top 5 dilemmas targeted parents face in parental alienation.